I'm Dave.
And I'm Rob.
We've got the same dad.
Only we didn't meet until I was 16.
So this is the podcast where
we share an album with each other.
That your
brother
should know. Fantastic.
Nailed it.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Your Brother Should Know. Today's album that we're going to be discussing and I'm presenting to Rob is Disintegration by The Cure. The Cure, do they even need an introduction? They're so big. But it's a podcast, so I better had to. They started in the late 70s, and they started as a kind of jangly pop guitar band. Their first album was pretty pop, actually. Three Imaginary Boys or Boys Don't Cry, depending on where you bought it. But Robert Smith, at the same time, was invited and became the main guitarist for Susie and the Banshees, and that was a big influence. So the next three Cure albums, 17 Seconds, Faith, Pornography, were a lot more goth. For many people, The Cure are goth. They invented goth. Miserable, shoegazing music, long musical passages about teenage angst and misery and bad things happening. But they held on to the pop tinge, and in the mid-80s, they went really pop with albums like The Top, Head on the Door, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me. Grew a big following, but they popped out to the extent that certainly your original goth fans were not happy, and neither with Robert Smith. He agreed with the goth naysayers. He thought the band was going in the wrong direction. So when they came to record Disintegration, lots of things were going on for him. He was approaching 30, and he thought, probably right actually, it's right for another podcast, that no one writes their rock or pop masterpiece after the age of 30, and he very much wanted to. And he was also, as I say, upset with the direction of the band, wanted to take them back to their more serious goth roots. And so The Cure went into the studio and produced a 73-minute long album of somber, miserable songs, introspective. They're about emotional fracturedness. They're about relationships breaking down. They're about an individual breaking down. They're about an individual breaking down in terms of his relationships with every part of his life, himself, his lovers, and society at large. But it was lapped up, ironically, for Robert Smith. Wanted to go back to his goth roots, but it made them bigger than ever. You could almost say it's their Joshua Tree, in that it took a band that were already pretty big and propelled them to massive stadium-filling superstardom. People loved it, as did the critics. AllMusic described it as hypnotic and mesmerizing. Rolling Stone described it as dark and brilliant. It's been a constant friend and companion for me for 30 years. I'm one of those people. I fell in love with it the first time I heard it and never been able to put it down since. So it was a surprise to me, given its size, Rob, that you'd never ever heard it. So, gave it to you a week ago. Tell me, Rob, should your brother know Disintegration by The Cure?
I'm going to sidestep that, because whether or not I should know it is another matter. Whether or not I wanted to know it, whether or not I enjoyed getting to know it, is a more pertinent concern. I'll level you. This hasn't been an easy listen, has it? It's really a record where I think you get out what you put in, and the longer you spend with it, and the longer you're able to enter that worldview, enter Robert Smith's twisted kind of bleak mental state, the more you'll get from it. I wonder how much that resonates with a new crowd, in the Spotify age. And I definitely, for the stage I'm in my life, it wasn't easy to find much resonance.
I guess one of the things you can't avoid talking about in this album is not just its length, but the length of all of its songs. So they stretch out musical ideas to their absolute limit. Now, I'm someone that loves the album, but I wonder what you found to just that idea of taking a kernel of a musical idea and clearly every song layering its arrangement and production upon, keyboard, percussion, guitar, lots of instrumentals before the singing even starts, and then massive long instrumental bits in the middle, and then massive long outros as well. I think you're right. I think if you're in the bleak emotional state that much this album spends its time in, I think that all works for you. But if you're not, maybe it doesn't. What did you think to that?
Yeah, I mean, I did find it quite tiring to listen to. I did find that these songs were frustrating at times. I often felt that, things could get going faster. I could definitely see how in the right headspace you might want to channel into that. And I can see how all the songs stack up to present some kind of emotional arc. But for me, that arc was really overbearingly earnest. It was very claustrophobic, and it was so bleak that I didn't often have the patience to really go there. And if you're not able to take that commitment, you kind of see through the songs very quickly, because in truth, they're all based around very, very rudimentary musical ideas. They're normally based around just 2, 3, or perhaps 4 chords that cycle round and round and round. And yet, this definitely builds up. The textures build up around it, and there's a lot of texture on this album, and a lot of moodscaping. And I appreciate how this kind of can paint pictures in the mind and take a sympathetic listener on a journey. For me, it was hard to access that plateau. Being, relatively well-balanced individual, perhaps if I'd encountered this as, 20 years ago as an angsty teenager, I would have felt very differently about it. But I didn't really have a place for it. And as I say, it's not an album for anyone short on time, which, again, for the purposes of this podcast, made it a particularly frustrating choice, I must say, Dave.
Well, apologies for that. But that itself is interesting, and part of the point of these podcasts is, we don't just get to share the music that we like, but we get to know each other better as well through this music. And I guess, so what you probably need to learn about me is that I have been in the bleak emotional state several times in my life where this absolutely resonates with me and serves as a fantastic comfort blanket for me, time and time again. I came to this album having listened to pretty much nothing but prog rock for about 10 years. And it surprised me how much this engaged with me, because it's clearly, prog rock is a world of interesting musical ideas. Everything changes every 20 seconds, time signatures. We're going to have a verse, a chorus, a bridge. We're going to do different things. This doesn't. It's more like minimalist classical music. It goes around, it finds a nice thing and goes around in circles. I came to realize that what it was doing was I was musically engaged because it did take me to that headspace, but it's certainly more of an emotional listen and experience for me than anything that I'd ever had, mostly with any of the prog rock that I'd listened to. And I think you're right. There is a fantastic emotional arc to this piece of work. It starts off, presenting an individual, and then takes you down his numerous kind of relationships breaking down, his psyche breaking down with Lullaby and his dreamscape. It talks about failed romances and relationships, and then you've got this big 4 tracks in the middle: Fascination Street, Prayers for Rain, Same Deep Water as You, and then all building to this fantastic cataclysm of Disintegration, this kind of explosion and rant on Robert Smith's part of all the emotions pouring out finally, because up till then it is all quite underground and somber, but Disintegration, it just bursts out like a rainstorm. And then the last 2 tracks, you sometimes wonder, well, did they just have 2 closing tracks of this album and couldn't choose between them, so they decided to go with both? I actually think they both say quite different things. So homesick, this being this idea that you sometimes you cannot go back to the emotionally fracturing things that you experienced in the past. And Untitled just gives it a fantastic emotional resolution. I'll never lose this pain, I'll never dream of you again. So it's almost like Robert Smith saying, it's fine, all of this stuff has happened, you've experienced it, it's been horrific, but at the end of it, and you're always going to have it. You're going to carry that pain with you, but you'll be alive to the extent that you're never going to dream about it again. It's never going to dominate your psyche again. So I find all that emotional arc an incredible journey, which has when I first heard it, I was probably 20 and in that kind of more kind of post-adolescent world you're talking about. But to be honest, even in the last 5 years, it's been a comfort and the album I reach to when I'm feeling at my lowest. And it still works for me I'm now 51-year-old man 30 years later.
Yeah, I completely understand that, and I don't think music needs to be complicated to be affecting. And I agree that some of the most simple music is the most affecting, and that's why, because there's a universality to it that anyone can really relate to, with or without any real understanding of how music works. You can be affected by a simple melody and a powerful lyric. I feel like if I have objections to this album, it's just that I'm not really sure that the music has for me at least, it has the infrastructure, the foundations to back up this kind of monument. I mean, for the one thing, coming at it with 2023, I find the whole thing sounds painfully dated. The synths that dominate, it's really hard sometimes to kind of penetrate through this what sounds quite rudimentary, both musically and technologically, and I find that quite a hindrance. I can definitely see that his vocals, Robert Smith's vocals, can be quite affecting, but often they come across as just, I don't know. He's not pitching amazingly for me. He's not necessarily pulling the right heartstrings, and it just feels a little bit whiny, a little bit self-absorbed. And yeah, this is just this overbearing mood of earnestness that I mentioned. I think it doesn't help that it starts with Plainsong. It's a very brave decision, to be honest, to start with such a lumbering, clumsy, musically simplistic dirge. Whereas the second song, to me, invites me in. That's a moment where I feel welcome. Pictures of You feels like it could be a single, feels like it's got something to say, and a bit more of the old Cure, perhaps. And perhaps that's the Cure I would like best.
Maybe it is, and Pictures of You was a single. I think you're right. I mean, for me, Plainsong just absolutely pictures it perfectly. It gives you no doubt as to what sort of experience you're about to have for 73 minutes. A perfect kind of atmospheric setting of the scene lyrically, and those massive keyboards coming in. And I mean, I think the problem with you finding the production of the music dated, I mean, your problem there is that you've listened to a lot of music in the last 20 years. What you want to do is to stop listening to music in about the year 2000, and then you think this stuff was great.
But I'm sorry, but that defense doesn't stack up.
No, I mean,
because all the music of the 60s and the 70s still sounds great. I think we all can all agree that the 80s had some problematic production. I mean, a lot of great artists made some questionable sonic decisions. In any case, I can try and see through that, but it's not so much the tech and the production. It is this quite pretentious claustrophobia it projects, and it's quite icy, I find. And this also goes with the guitar sound. I find it kind of... I do find some of those long, drawn-out intros compelling. I can see how they conjure a mood, and really... It's so when, they're quite simple, but they can really paint a picture that draws the listener in, so that when the lyric finally does come, you're listening, and you're already on the same emotional wavelength of the person who wrote it. Maybe there's a few too many of them.
Yeah, I wondered about the guitar sound, and it's one of the questions because, for me as a very simplistic guitarist, I wonder sometimes if the reason I like them so much is because it's proof, if proof were needed, that you do not have to be an absolute fret king to make brilliant sounding, emotionally engaging music, which I almost know the answer to this question, but I know you agree with that. But when I've listened to this album, I have wondered you're probably a more able guitarist than Robert Smith, right? So what do you think listening to this? Does that?
I don't think I'd be. I don't feel in any way unhumble. It's safe that I am. Yeah.
Okay. Whereas I come from this from a kind of, I'm not quite as good, nowhere near as good a guitarist as Robert Smith. So I go, wow, that's pretty clever, and also it gives me great hope that simplistic stuff can really work. But where did that leave you?
Yeah, no, I was on board with a lot of it. I do think it's kind of curious, like how he plays in this kind of what I feel is very horizontal way.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, as you say, it's kind of anti-virtuosic, but in a quite novel fashion, rather than running up and down the fretboard in conventional pentatonic scales, as so many rock guitarists would do, especially rudimentary rock guitarists that are trying to say perhaps more than their vocabulary allows.
Yeah.
But again, that can be engaging when a limited player is just making his instrument howl.
Yeah,
I mean that's some of the most exciting guitarists with guitar playing. But rather than that, he seems to be kind of painting these kind of angular, kind of sketching, I almost feel, on this very kind of horizontal, going up and down, very methodically. A lot of playing on the beat. And yeah, very little in the way of ornamentation. I mean, okay, maybe sliding, but not much in the way of vibrato and no bending really. Which again is quite quite a kind of obvious go-to technique when you want to evoke emotion is just to bend the note, because it's like you're affecting speech in some way, or you're deliberately hitting something that's not quite in tone, but that's why it sounds great. That's why the blues is all about bends. And that's why pianists always struggle to play the blues, right? Because they're slurring between semitones to try and create that.
Because pianists are
that sound.
That Paul Deers are playing a percussion instrument.
But that's how he's playing quite pianistically, as in just going.
That's what I was going to say. It's almost like he's decided he's going to use guitar as just, as inverted commas, just another keyboard. And he picks out little melody lines that he repeats, which is something you get in quite a lot of pop and rock music. What the keyboardist ends up doing is quite simple chord pads or little melodies that kind of repeat over and over. And whereas the guitarist is given free rein to do all sorts, as you say, go up and down the fretboard and do bending. And it just feels like it's a conscious decision to go, right, percussion's doing that, keyboard's doing that. I'm going to add a little textured melody, which don't just repeat. They just kind of repeat with a little bit of a change of a little semitone change note here or something here. Which to me, because I'm immersed in this stuff and I am emotionally and conceptually immersed in this stuff, just does make me, I suppose if I wasn't, my more critical bit of thinking would be going, I'm getting a bit bored now because they're doing the same thing. I never actually think that. I'm just constantly entertained by this, this mesh of what's going on between the core of the percussion, the keyboards and the guitar. And I find it incredibly effective and powerful. And then the lyrics come in and the voice comes in, which, I mean, I accept on the one hand, you go, it's kind of miserable sounding and kind of slightly 6-4 minutes lyrics. But on the other hand, the music almost seems to like carve its way into that world for you, that it almost makes it acceptable for that to be the mood that the lyrics then come into.
Well, speaking just about the guitar playing, I'd be really interested to know if Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins was familiar with this album, because he's a very virtuosic player. He can squeal and wail with the best of them, although I'd say he rarely put down a truly memorable solo, as in something you could hum, maybe Cherub Rock, maybe a few moments, but not often. He very good at pyrotechnics, but he also seems to play, to me, quite what I call horizontally, and he very much likes playing on the rhythm, and he plays a lot of his riffs are built around these kind of droning octaves. And to me, that only really, the similarity, which may be superficial, but it only really struck me when I was listening to Robert Smith's home demos for this album, and I was actually surprised how much of the music had been developed before he took it to the band. I must confess, I assumed he was a kind of, because to be quite frank, the musical ideas are so rudimentary at times. I assumed he was just kind of plucking a few chords and coming in there, and the band were responsible for most of the arrangements, especially given the fact that the whole band is credited as co-composers.
Sure.
But assuming that he played every part on these home demos, which I can only imagine, he's actually coming in with very developed musical ideas. Like, I think it's, well, not definitely what I'd consider one of the weakest tracks on the album, but Fascination Street, for example, that sliding aggressive bass line is there from the start. That wasn't something the bassist was bringing in. That was something that he brought. So these very simple ideas had actually been fleshed out almost seemingly completely in their sonic and even their musical arrangement, which actually leaves one to wonder what the rest of the band are getting paid for.
Well, that's really interesting because, and it would be interesting to know what stage those demos were at, because the way I'd read that this was created is literally, that Robert Smith went in with the kind of broad musical ideas, and that they all went away and made little demos on their own of each track. So they ended up with about 4 or 5 different versions from each band member of about 30 songs, and then kind of had a massive choosing between both song and arrangement as a band. So yeah, I don't, who knows how iterative that process was and what
I have to say, if as charitable as I'm being to this record, if they came in with 30 plus songs and these were the most interesting musical ideas to emerge, that to me is a little bit troubling, because whilst I appreciate the textual and emotional collages that are being painted in front of your ears, I do consider these songs very rudimentary, and I almost at times wonder if the foundations are strong enough to support these kind of mammoth totemic structures that they have built. And that's kind of the essential question to me, which I can't quite answer because I think it really depends who's listening. But for me, when it comes to if I'm going to engage with this album further and come back to it, it's unlikely, because I often find there's not enough to reward me
Sure.
Musically, certainly there's definitely not enough to reward me musically, but emotionally, I can see what's happening. But peeling beneath the onion of those lyrics, I haven't studied every lyric, but as you say, it does sound so maudlin, so whiny, so self-obsessed, so self-absorbed, so kind of contained in their own universe. It's hard not to kind of find them so willfully self-indulgent that it's sixth form poetry, like you said. I don't know sometimes if all these songs justify their own existence.
Yeah, no, and I guess I get that in that. Well, I think there's two things there. For me, the lyric idea, I think the point is if you're in this kind of miserable mood, you're by definition self-obsessed. That cliche of you need to get out and get a life and get some relationships, etc. That's true. And if you're feeling this unhappy with the world, you are self-obsessed. So I don't mind the self-obsession of the lyrics because I think it fits how you feel when you're in that mood. Musically, I guess that just comes down to subjective views. You just said that Fascination Street for you is one of the weakest songs on the album. It's one of my absolute favourites, and I think it is just a great, almost kind of rock out energy burst within the rest of the album, which I was going to say anyway. For me, musically, although go on.
I just wanted to rewind a second because I had to retort.
Go on.
Apologies. I'm a little bit confused about this self-indulgent, maudlin, morose, depressed mess because, as I understand it, hadn't he just got married and therefore should be in the definition of his honeymoon period of his life?
I guess, but when you read anything about the creation of this album, what it tells you is that Robert Smith was deeply unhappy, I suppose professionally, I guess. He had a view that The Cure was not where he wanted it to be. He had a view that he hadn't written his masterpiece. He had a view that his band members were kind of self-inflated egos that needed taking down a peg or two. And he was apparently,
he had lots of views, in fact.
He had lots of views, well, he's a band leader. They have lots of views,
I just wish he'd expressed a few more of them and more eloquently on this album.
Harsh. He was apparently also self-medicating for all that depression on LSD. So I think the thing to say about the music is that I actually don't just find it one style. I get that there's an overall kind of a musical approach, but one of the things that I like about the album is that within that musical approach there is a love song. There's a kind of pop tune, lullaby. There's some flat out rockers as well, Fascination Street, and Prayers for Rain. So I think there's quite a lot of musical variety within this overall picture of a kind of style, if you like. All right. I have to ask, if I was to ask you one thing that you liked about the album, what would it be?
Yeah, by far the most emotionally affecting moment for me is the title track. I think it has got something to do with its placement on the record, but overall, I just think it's a piece of music that does sound quite apart from the rest of the album, and it has this real urgency to it, musically and lyrically. And it's difficult not to grab it. It locks in very early with a tight groove. And that kind of post-punk device of changing the root note but droning a second note on the bass. I think he's just leaving the open G string hanging. And you instantly kind of feel it. And it does sound like it I wouldn't say it doesn't belong on this record, but it definitely serves a welcome counterpoint after all the kind of morose mediocrity that has been leading up to it. So I really enjoyed that. No, and to be honest, I think overall, I the songs that did appeal to me, and this might make me sound a bit basic, but maybe it's just because of the way I've engaged with the music and the time in my life I've engaged with it. I think generally the shorter, more upbeat ones did affect me. So I quite liked Pictures of You. I thought it was it was a bit of a two-chord dirge, but after Plainsong, it was a very much more welcome, sentimental, windswept MTV dirge, which I can just about get. It did potentially sound a bit like a stalker anthem. And then Love Song, which you just mentioned. I mean, yeah, again, I think if you can park what is a little bit of an unashamedly cheesy lyric, I like that. Again, that one really feels much like Disintegration of a band in a room grooving. And this may be the basic response to have, but these are the ones that appealed to me the most.
Okay. No, and I'd agree. I mean, Disintegration for me, coming at the end of it, I've talked about the big four for me, because I do think it's kind of almost scatological, the first 4 or 5 songs up to Last Dance and Lullaby, which we'll come back to. But once it gets to Fascination Street, Prayers for Rain, Same Deep Water as You, and then Disintegration, that as a kind of EP on a loop, I could listen to for weeks, because I think the way it builds to the, as we've talked about, that kind of climax of Disintegration, is by far my favourite part of the album. Okay, on top of the songs being overtly too long, the guitar being a bit basic, and the lyrics being sort of pretentious and maudling, was there anything else that you didn't like about the album?
I'd correct you there.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, I'd like the lyrics to be more pretentious. I think they're under-ambitious.
Right.
I prefer it if he was reaching beyond his, immediate mental state a little bit.
Okay.
Honestly, as I've said, I do find Plain Song, I understand the role it plays, but for me, it's, forgive the pun, quite overtly plain. I didn't really. I mean, I find Close Down and Last Dance just a little bit basic, a little bit. There's so much kind of pretension in them. I felt that Close Down makes the Smashing Pumpkins themselves sound like Black Sabbath. That's. And then I feel like the 1-2 of the 2 longest songs on the album, Prayers for Rain and the Same Deep Water as You.
Mm-hmm.
I think that adds up to 18 or 19 minutes between them, and really nothing happens. And I think this is probably, for you, the emotional core of the album, and for me, it's the part where I utterly lose patience.
Okay.
I think there's a certain moment in the Same Deep Water as You where he says, this is the very last thing before either you go or I go.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember sitting there listening to it thinking, like, I really wish it was, but you're still singing and you haven't gone anywhere.
And there's another half hour of the album to go. Yeah.
Having said all that, of course, I appreciate the role it's played in your life. And while it's obviously not pleasant to hear, it's no surprise to me that you've lent on this record at times. But is there anything that you don't enjoy and anything you find yourself skipping?
Okay, so I guess
on those long, deep, dark nights of the soul,
those long, deep darks where I'm listening to the entire album. The song that gets skipped is Lullaby. The sort of it was the first song anybody heard off the album because it was the first single, and I find it doesn't really fit the overall kind of musical and emotional envelope of the rest of the album. It's interesting because lyrically it's slightly, is it slightly less self-obsessed almost, because it's not just saying this is how I feel, which I get, that is what he's doing, but I kind of quite like the honesty of that. And what he's saying is just taking us on a journey around some bad dreams he had. And I just find it a little bit of an offshoot I don't need, a cul-de-sac almost. And musically, it would probably fit better on the previous, well, probably Head on the Door, as a kind of Curie type whimsical song rather than this kind of dark masterpiece type song. So that's the one that I find myself skipping.
That's interesting, because while I wouldn't say it was my favourite song, it's definitely one of the ones that I enjoyed the most, and it's probably the most musically interesting actually, because it has got that different rhythm going on. It's got a, it's got a pleasant plod to it. It's kind of poppy, but not overtly suffocatingly cheery, so it does fit in. I did feel like it probably came from a different session when I first listened to it. But the detail that I really appreciated, and I only kind of heard on, I don't know, the fifth or sixth listen, was the string part. Those little kind of little 2 or 3 note whatever, like little shots that are going in. It's not a consistent like strings chording underneath. It's just these little kind of percussive spurts which really play against the guitar, and it adds a quite rhythmic element to a record which frankly is really lacking in groove, in rhythmic variation. So not my favorite song on the record, and I do find the lyric a little bit oblique. But hey, what is Spider-Man having for dinner tonight?
What is he? But I think that's what I mean. I agree. I think it's got some interesting musical ideas. And an album, I'll say it again, Head on the Door, had some very interesting sort of quirky musical ideas with some quirky lyrics, and I think it would fit very nicely on there, and I'd probably enjoy it on there. It just doesn't fit on this album because, if you're looking for groove, this is not the place to come. Almost willfully, there's no groove on this album. We haven't talked about my absolute highlight of the album, Prayers for Rain. I think that's an absolutely fantastic song. I mean, for two reasons. One is it's clearly about an abusive relationship, someone trapped in an awful relationship. And I find the way he conveys that to be entirely convincing, and entirely, well, sometimes art is just about it makes you feel better because someone else has been through it. And I'm convinced by that. So the idea of just, being in such a bad place that, that even praying for rain, even rain is better than where you are, really strikes a chord with me. But musically, I love it. And I know that it's from the beginning of that it builds up, and then there's that fantastic massive cymbal at the beginning, that kind of sets you off on the journey of the song. And to be pretentious for a moment, it's like the overhit cymbal in Kind of Blue, the Miles Davis Kind of Blue, where, oh God, what is the first song? Is it So What? No, it's,
yes. It's So What?
It's So What? And it builds what? And then
it's Jimmy Cobb.
Jimmy Cobb hits the cymbal, and it's the same feeling. It's kind of built till there, and then the overhit cymbal just kind of changes the song into something different. I don't know if the Cure Boys were a big fan of Kind of Blue, but it always reminds me of that moment always reminds me of the overhit cymbal in Kind of Blue. And then I love the rest of the song.
The part that really troubles me is that many people do regularly pray for rain, quite literally. It's a source of subsistence that we all need, and drought is a real problem. And as is, as is a lack of food in much of the developing world. So,
fair enough.
I think his metaphor is a little bit clumsy.
But I'm not sure. Okay, but he's praying for emotional rain rather than physical rain. So that's his get out. And yes, I've just used the phrase "pray for emotional rain." So I'm right in there with Robert Smith.
I don't know what emotional rain is.
Nor do I. Nor do I, but it works for me.
I do appreciate what you say about there being two closing songs, because it's kind of quite brave. But I guess after you've exhausted the audience with an hour of this, bleak worldview, you assume they're with you. So. For my money, Untitled, I find a far more compelling song than Homesick, to be honest. I quite like the way it plays out with the three guitars simultaneously playing different lead lines. It almost sounds a little bit like someone's got a loop station, which now is passé, but in 1989 was quite interesting. Homesick, again, the way the outro builds, it reminded me a little bit of Black by Pearl Jam, actually, where you got the bass kind of haunting up there, and you got one thing that's kind of repeating over and over again to emotional exhaustion. I'd argue we didn't maybe need both of them, but I mean, if you put people through Prayers for Rain and Same Deep Water as You, then I find those two as a pair much easier to get through. Yeah,
I have asked myself that question, but then I asked myself the question. Almost after Disintegration, you're on such a you've been almost destroyed emotionally so much. I think you need two but I think that is the great
to build yourself back up.
No, literally that, Robin. I think that's the great joy of this album. Is for me, it is a joy to listen to. But it leaves me feeling in a better place than it finds me, and I think it's because of those two closing songs. Without that, it would just fracture me, as the song says. I'm fractured, But both of those two closers have a different way of putting me back together again.
I'm intrigued to know what you think of Last Dance and Close Down, because I find them both quite claustrophobic and melodramatic, and they're some of the ones that I found it harder to appreciate. Where do they fit in your album art?
Yeah, I see what you mean, and I think they're probably the weakest songs on the album. But it's sort of musically and ideas wise, because although I don't think Lullaby fits, I think it's a better song, if you like. So they're the two songs that you could cheerfully do without. But I think for the arc of the album, where you are in it for the long haul, the cheap way of doing it would be just to listen to, and I keep saying those big four, and you'd kind of almost get the same feel. But I think Close Down and Last Dance, they're part of this painting, this picture of somebody that is not in a good place. All is not well in the world, and for different reasons, whether it's because of an old lover or Close Down is just an utter kind of I've closed down from the world. I think without those two, you don't get quite the picture that Disintegration and the two closers would then put you back together with.
See, for a hot minute, it sounds like you were about to concede that this perfect album that you've been listening to 30 plus years could actually be a good 10, 15 minutes shorter. And honestly, I think I would probably have more space for it in my life if it was shorter. I don't think it's a coincidence this album came out in 1989, to be honest, because this is, you've got all the extended studio time and demoing and big production that was the excesses of the 80s age. Let's face it, a big rock band making a big record. But you've finally given them the extended runtime of a CD, which can run to 74 minutes at that point, right? Without any extra expense to fans, without it having to be a big statement, or this evidently was a big statement. So to me, that it does feel a little bit like they, or perhaps just Smith himself, has allowed the kind of inner ego, the inner id to run wild a little bit. And this may have been to me a stronger album had it, been made a few years earlier on what was still the vinyl era, and they would have had to cram it onto 45, max 50 minutes. And that might have been a better record. Let's face it, music has always been dictated by the medium it's consumed on. Right?
Sure.
That's been the case. Like a single was the length because that's what a 7-inch, or before that a 78 could accommodate, right? 3.5 minutes. And then obviously we built up with albums, and albums were largely 40, max 45 minutes in the vinyl era. And the CD era changed that. And now again, streaming means, if anything, we're going to the 20, 25 minute EP drop is probably the most common thing right now, simply because you make the biggest impact with your work, your effort to impact ratio when it comes to like media hype and fan satisfaction is highest when you have product regularly, but not a huge amount of product that's going to take years to record. So I think we need to be really clear that this album is a victim of the era that it was made in, as much as the creative headspace of those who are making it.
And I agree. That said, I go back to, this was a massive commercial success, far more than The Cure ever, or their record company ever dreamed. I mean, Robert Smith was trying to hark back to, his goth roots, and it was an so it clearly, its length, its production, its moroseness, if you like, it struck a very long chord with an awful lot of people, because people wanted to hear this in stadium rock environments and listen to, all 73 minutes of it and every song. And there's still, there's just been I don't know what anniversary tour of it, so that they've done it, a few times in Australia in its entirety.
34 years?
Yeah, something like that. And people are hanging on to every note, including Close Down and Last Dance. So
I would actually say, so I had the misfortune to see The Cure at a festival in Japan about 4 years ago, just pre-COVID. And I found the set largely underwhelming. There were moments of joy, of course, Boys Don't Cry, etc. But largely it was a bit of a big fat yawn for me. And I remember feeling quite disconnected from the rest of the crowd when you've got tens of thousands of people getting very excited, and particularly the people I was with who are big Cure fans, and turning to look at one of my very good friends and seeing a tear roll down her cheek and just thinking, what am I missing here? What am I not getting? And the kind of kicker is when I looked up the set list a couple of days ago and found out they played 7 songs of this album. So maybe that's the proof that it wasn't the record for me.
Well, I'm almost glad to hear that you've never been in a state where you've engaged in this emotionally, because it's not a great place to be, let's face it. So well on you for never having to have Disintegration in your life. So, fair to say, not your favourite musical moment. Can you imagine a world or a place, if one had to listen to this, or if you had to listen to this, where would be the best place to do so?
I'm in the hospital ward. They're about to cut off my morphine. I can see no more reason to live. But part of me, there's a human spirit, a little part of me, a little voice inside that's going, Rob, don't give up. You can beat it. You're going to be okay. There's stuff to live for. And I would put this album on in my last dying hours to realize how bleak existence is, and that I'm happy to pass on into the nothing life ahead.
Okay. Whereas, see, I would disagree. So I think that's a perfect place to listen to, but I think it would turn you round because of the last 2 tracks. That would be like a warm comfort blanket and make everything pretty and rosy again. And it would be the start of you coming out of that desperate need for morphine.
So
So when did you discover The Cure, and especially this record?
Well, I was at uni and I was playing prog rock and Neil Young loudly in my room, and my friend said, "Please stop playing that. We can all hear it." Can you? Which is fair enough. And can you please, listen to this, The Cure? And at the time, my image of The Cure were of a fashion band. I thought they were a pop fashion band. Because of things like Head on the Door. And so I first heard this probably, coming back drunk from a uni party in my first year in my student room, and thinking, I'll put that on then instead of Jethro Tull. And I probably didn't go to sleep until it was all over, and thought, wow, that's an incredible thing. I will play that again.
So you can tell that I'm intrigued, at least. Yeah. I probably should know some more Cure in my life. I do like the early pop singles. What should I or our listeners go away and listen to next?
Okay, so I think the thing about this album is, in terms of the Cure catalogue, I think it kind of does stand alone a little bit. Because, to be honest, after this, and I'm sure there are some Cure diehards out there, but, it didn't go so well for the Cure. They did massive tours on the back of this, and then, they had Wish, the album, which was a little bit hit and miss, and Wild Mood Swings that got panned. And they did Blood Flowers, which Robert Smith claimed was sort of a trilogy with this and Pornography, but didn't quite hit the heights for the listening public or critical reception. So after this album, it's hard to say, this is what you must listen to. It was almost like Robert Smith was right. He wrote his masterpiece just before the age of 30, and then it wasn't great afterwards. And before this, things are very different. You've got Jangly Pop, Boys Don't Cry, the album, which is a great Jangly Pop album. You've got the kind of three, kind of shoegazing gothy guitar music, which if you like the overall feel of this album, then, that's Faith, Pornography and, 17 Seconds, then that would be a place to go to if you like this album, but it's a very different sound. And then you've got, the three in the middle, the top, Head on the Door and Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, which that's where I'd go, because I think there's a lot of good stuff in there that's just kind of musically imaginative. And Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me especially, it's a double album that just goes all over the place stylistically and emotionally. Doesn't have the conceptual whole that this does emotionally, because nothing else does. This is not like anything else the Cure have ever done before or since. And it's quite hard to go, is it anything like anybody else has done before or since? 73 minutes of long stretched out songs, maudlinness, Forever and Ever, that actually does manage to strike a chord with people and be very, very popular rather than turn people off in their droves. The place I would go to personally, if you love this album, is to hear it live. There was an album just afterwards called Entreat, which was essentially live versions of this. And as I say, on YouTube, there've been all kinds of them, doing the whole song, the whole album live. And I actually think some of these songs, going back to your production point, do work a little bit better live. So, yes, there is a sly 80s kind of over tinny, compressed kind of pop production to it, which you lose in the live environment. And certainly some of the rockier ones like Fascination Street, and Prayers for Rain, rocky song, but in the context of this album, it is, that do come across better, I think. So, I think there's live albums to go to.
Dave, I have to ask.
Yes.
Were you ever a goth?
No. And that's the weird thing, because this album, and that's why I'm not very good on The Cure as a whole, as you can tell. I listened to prog rock, I was listening to Jethro Tull and early Genesis, and then my mate at uni said, please, Dave, stop playing that stuff. Here's something you should listen to, and it was this. And it was totally different, and I expected to hate it because it wasn't musically as interesting originally, I felt, because it didn't have the same changing all the time, but it totally grabbed me emotionally and has done ever since. But it was my, if you like, springboard into Cure world, which I've basically described. I like some of it, but it, I'm not necessarily a Cure fan. I'm a Disintegration fan. So no, I was never a goth. Also, I had the wrong hair color to be a goth.
You could have dyed it.
I could have died if I could have done.
I'm pretty sure Robert Smith is still dyeing his hair.
I'm pretty sure he is. Okay, so that is Disintegration by The Cure, an album I will continue to love and enjoy, and I accept it's one I don't listen to unless I need to, and so probably won't hope that I'd never have to listen to it again, which might be the world you're in as well.
I mean, fingers crossed.
So an album that you now know about, but perhaps will never play again.
That sounds like a fair estimation.
All right.
Yeah.
So what will you be making me listen to over the next week or so as a return visit?
Well, I'm going to drag your Gen X behind into the 21st century, kicking, screaming. It just turned 10 years old. Let's do Random Access Memories by Daft Punk.
Blimey. Okay. Well, that'll be different for me. Look forward to it very much. In the meantime, thanks for listening, everybody.